Hello everyone, it's a very exciting day at Gazovitz because we're doing our third and final Solar Sunday of the year. So we only do a couple of these, or three of these Solar Sundays a year. Always a really exciting and momentous day at Gazovitz when we do one. Our first Solar Sunday this year was in February, and our second Solar Sunday was in March. So this is the third of a trilogy of Solar Sundays. Will be the final Solar Sunday of this year. The reason it's the final Solar Sunday is because when we get to winter updates, we're only 3 weeks away now from the winter updates, actually. So it's beginning to get very, very close to starting winter updates. And when we begin those winter updates, of course, solar activity always plays an important part in both winter updates and the final forecast that we issue at the beginning of the winter. We will sort of be looking at solar activity on a week-by-week basis anyway through the autumn. So there'll be no need to do Solar Sunday. So that's the reason we sort of laid off from August onwards. And our next Solar Sunday will actually be in 2018. Can you believe? So, as I say, this is the final Solar Sunday of the year. We're going to see what's going on in terms of solar activity. We'll also have a little bit on the winter as well, just to whet your appetite slightly for those winter updates. And I think it's going to be an interesting and fun video. Just think it's going to be quite a long video, so if you can't watch it all in one go, don't worry, it will be placed on the Solar Cycles 24-25 updates page later on today, probably around 7 o'clock this evening. There'll be a written report that goes with it as well on the Solar Cycle 24-25 updates page. So you can come back and watch the video whenever you want, and also you'll be able to read that written report whenever you would like to do that as well. Because of today's updates, there'll be no Gazovitz Sunday Roundup, so that'll return next week. And just say this afternoon, really exciting developments, because this afternoon we're going to have an interpretation, our interpretation of the ECWS seasonal model. This is very unique content to Gazovitz. The ECWS seasonal model is not publicly available, but I've had a bit of a butcher's at it in the past few days, and we've done an interpretation of what I've witnessed in terms of the ECWS seasonal model for the winter of 2017-2018. So you get your first snapshot this afternoon. Very exciting. First snapshot this afternoon of the ECWS seasonal model, what it's predicting for the winter of 2017-2018. That's going to be really, really interesting stuff. So stick around for that this afternoon. But I think we're better get on with Solar Sunday. So we're going to begin with the solar disk on our side of this today from solarham.net. And we're looking for sunspots, and there aren't many to be seen. We've just got one area of sunspots over here. Otherwise, actually, we're virtually spotless on the solar disk on our side of the disk today. And Solarham is officially designating solar activity as being at very low levels. So again, another day where we're at very low levels, which you would expect us to be at now, of course, on most days, because we are trending remorselessly and relentlessly down into solar minimum. So this is the Gazovitz Summer Season Daily Solar Activity Tracker from our good friend James Ackrill. And just to say that from this on, every chart that you see in this Solar Sunday has been provided to me by James Ackrill. So I know James is going to be watching. Big thank you to James for coming through with all of these charts for Solar Sunday today. As ever, I couldn't do particularly the longer range stuff and the solar stuff without James's help and input. So big sort of thumbs up, there we go, big thumbs up to James, and big thanks again for providing the tracker and all of the other data that you're going to see in Solar Sunday today. So in terms of sunspots, the sort of orange line here is indicating sunspots on a day-by-day basis. You see that we are getting many days now that are having no sunspots. So we had a run of no sunspots there. We have more days with no sunspots just here. But we are also getting some sunspots occasionally. So this is where we actually are right now in terms of sunspot numbers. We are at a very, very low level right now. The charts you see in a moment will actually look more dramatic than this. This perhaps doesn't look all that dramatic. It doesn't really show the very low level of solar activity we are now at, particularly. But the subsequent charts will do that. So because we're at a very low level of sunspots and solar activity at the moment, the trend lines are all moving downwards. So the thick green line, the thick red line, and the thick pink line here are all trending downwards. We haven't quite gone to where we was in January. Very briefly, we got to that level, a very, very low level, just briefly in January before it lifted up again. We aren't far off from that though, and I suspect over the next month or two we may well get down to that level, or maybe even lower actually, in terms of the trend lines for solar activity. Now this is depicting solar cycle 24, which is the current solar cycle, of course, on a sort of monthly on a monthly type basis. So what's interesting about this, that now you can see that we are more or less back to where we was very early in the cycle. So this is the beginning of solar cycle 24, just here, the current solar cycle back in 2008. You see how there was a very, very slow, very gradual, really protracted lift up in this solar cycle until in 2011, at the end of 2011, we had our first solar maximum, our first peak of solar maximum, before we dropped down through 2012 and 2013. And then in 2014 we lifted up again and we had our second peak of solar maximum, and that is our highest peak of this solar cycle, which is quite unusual because the second peak normally comes out under the first peak. So this solar cycle, a bit a strange solar cycle all the way along, really, solar cycle 24, and that was quite odd how the second peak was actually higher, and that was the actual solar maximum of solar cycle 24, higher than the first peak, which doesn't normally happen. Since the start of 2014, when we had that second peak, we've been trending relentlessly downwards out of solar maximum, been unraveling, if you like, solar maximum. You see, not a linear process, because as we've gone along on a month-by-month basis, we've been dropping down, spiking up, dropping down, spiking back up again, and so on. And it's not a linear process. You do find that you get spikes, ebbs and flows, really, as you trend, though, down into solar minimum. This is where we are right now. We're just here in terms of the trend, and we're just here in terms of the monthly sunspot number. So our very latest month, which is going to be updated through to July, is actually this orange spot just here. It's along this line that you see there. Can I manage to draw a straight line? Just about. There we go. So it's along this line just here. So when was the last time it was at this sort of level of sunspots, monthly sunspots? And you can see it was actually at this level sort of late 2009 into 2010. So we're at 2009 or late 2009 and 2010 levels now in terms of sunspot numbers. Now, what's very interesting about this period in the solar cycle, of course, that we are back at right now, what's interesting in terms of that level is that that was a period of very cold weather. 2009, 2010, they were cold winters, 08, 09, 09, 10, and of course the December to remember in December 2010. And we are at that level, that kind of level now, of sunspot numbers. The difference, though, and there is an important difference, and we'll discuss this a lot more in the winter update, but I'll just briefly touch on it now. The difference is that this period, back in 09 and 2010, we was lifting out of solar minimum and heading upwards, whereas this period we're still coming out of solar maximum, unraveling, if you like, solar maximum. And obviously we aren't at solar minimum yet, because we'll know we're at solar minimum when we reach that level with the trend. So this rusty coloured line here is going to eventually, by about there, be doing something a bit like that. So when we get to that sort of level just there, then we'll be in true solar minimum. It'll be around then, and afterwards, in this period just here, so 2020 to 2022, that would have our greatest chance of colder winters. And that would be then in line with where we was in 2009 and 2010. So whilst we are at the same level of sunspots right now as we was in 2009 and 2010, doesn't necessarily mean the same outcome in terms of what the winters are going to do. This is comparing the current solar cycles number 24 to solar cycle 23, the past solar cycle. Again, it just puts in context how weak this cycle has been compared to the last cycle number 23. So this is the solar maximum of solar cycle 23 just here. You see we did get a second peak and it occurred just there. So the first maximum happened in the year 2000. The second maximum happened in 2002. In between, we had a drop down, as tends to happen. But you see about the second maximum, this is kind of like what you tend to see with these solar cycles. The second maximum here comes under the first maximum. So usually the second maximum, or second peak, I should say, is weaker than the first peak. The first peak tends to be the true solar maximum of the solar cycle. I say this one did it differently. So that's the solar maximum of solar cycle 23. 23, by the way, ran from 1996 to 2008. So very quick lift up into the solar maximum of 23. Just there was no delay on getting that solar cycle going, unlike what's happened with solar cycle 24, and then a very prolonged and pronounced drop into solar minimum. It took longer than normal to get to solar minimum, but when it occurred, it was a more prolonged solar minimum happening around there from, let's say, late 2007 to 2008, after which we had, again, we know that very prolonged and unsteady lift into the solar cycle until we reached our first peak. Then we dropped down and we had our second peak, and now we are going down to there, and this is where we are right now. So again, you can see that where we are right now in terms of the current solar cycle is where we was back in 2009, 2010, at that sort of level there. And in terms of the previous solar cycle, number 23, so we're probably on a par, and this is perhaps more where we are as well, because we're probably on a par with 2005, 2006, that sort of period of solar cycle number 23. And that, of course, again, it's in the period where we're coming out of solar maximum as opposed to coming out of solar minimum. So I would have thought, actually, 2005, 2006, that period just there, is probably more sort of the period we should be looking at right now, rather than 2009 and 2010. But the key point is just how much weaker this solar cycle has been compared to the past solar cycle. This is just looking at solar flux, again comparing cycle 23 to 24. Solar flux is kind of like the noise that's being given off from the sun's energy. Very hard to describe solar flux, but it's almost, if you think, it's almost like throwing out energy from the ball of gas that is the sun, and the more solar flux you have, sort of the more noise and more energy you have coming out of the sun. So again, you see that solar cycle 23 had a lot of solar flux. Solar cycle 24, current solar cycle, it has had a much lower level of solar flux. Again, in terms of where we are with solar flux, we're just here right there, not quite where we will be at solar minimum, which will be down at that sort of level, but really not too far off. It's around 12 months or so away now before we go into the true solar minimum of solar cycle 24. This is looking at all solar cycles, right back to solar cycle number 1, which is up here, and of course 24 indicated by the red line, which is down there, the current solar cycle. Again, this just puts into context how weak the solar cycle 24 has been compared to most of the solar cycles. So our most active solar cycle is actually this one, which is the green one up here, and I think that is probably going to be solar cycle number 19. I'm sure somebody will correct me if that is wrong, but it looks like it should be. Anyway, solar cycle number 19. But you see, actually, most of the solar cycles with their maximums are up here, and where we have been with solar cycle 24 is way down here with the maximum. Again, you see the double peak. We have the first peak of solar cycle 24 just there. The second peak is just there. At that sort of level, down with the very weakest solar cycles that we've ever seen. Not quite at the weakest, the very weakest solar cycle, solar maximum anyway, was this one just here. But we are down, most definitely, with the weakest solar cycles, and most of the solar cycles, their maximums, are actually up here. So again, just goes to show you how unique, really, the solar cycle 24 has been, and sort of how unusual this solar cycle has been compared to so many past solar cycles, particularly those of the 20th century. I don't think really a lot of people understand and realise just how unusual this solar cycle has been. But that does put it into context, and it has been a very unique solar cycle indeed. So these are sort of the weakest solar cycles, if you like, and these are the ones that we are on a par with. We're on a par with number 5, number 6, number 12, that's the important one, number 14, number 16, and of course our current solar cycle is number 24, indicated by the red. So the strongest of those solar cycles is this blue line just here, that's number 16. The weakest of these solar cycles is this one, actually, which is solar cycle number 6. And number 5 is indicated by the orange line. Those two solar cycles are in the Dalton minimum, what we call the Dalton minimum, occurring in the early part of the 1800s, and in around a period of really quite unusual weather, particularly around a period of cold winters. Now, we haven't been with those Dalton minimum cycles, number 5 and number 6. We've been up here at this level, so not the we've not been at the very weakest level in terms of the solar cycle, but not far off from it. We've been on a par with solar cycles 12 and 14, essentially. So, and number 12 is quite important because we've been very, very close to that particular solar cycle. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But you can see how we're moving out into solar minimum now, and this is where we are compared to those very weak solar cycles. And actually, interestingly, so the two weakest solar cycles, number 5 and number 6, they took a little bit longer really to get down into solar minimum, whereas the solar cycles we're on a par with, number 12 and number 14, they tended, and now number 16 as well, they tended to move down a little bit more quickly in towards solar minimum. There's not much in it, but you can see where we're heading. Anyway, in the next sort of 12 months or so, we're going to be in this sort of level. And when we get to that level, that is when we will be going into the true solar minimum of solar cycle number 24. So this is a comparison between solar cycle number 12 and number 24. And this is updated to last month as well. So all the way along, really, these two solar cycles, number 24, the current solar cycle, and number 12. Number 12 is a solar cycle that ran from the year 1878 through to 1890. All the way along, these two solar cycles have lined up very, very closely. So the way we have the very prolonged lift out of solar minimum up to solar maximum was very similar. Then we get our double peak, or our first peak, I should say, of the two peaks that occur in these solar cycles happening just there. Both solar cycles then have that drop down, and then we get the second peak. And interestingly, on both of these solar cycles, the first peak is a little bit less than the second peak. So all the way along, lining up very closely. And then the way we've moved out of solar maximum and gone down in towards solar minimum, that has happened in a very similar way as well. So where we are right now with solar cycle 24 compared to solar cycle 12 is just here. And again, you see we are lining up very, very closely. We haven't yet dropped down into true solar minimum. That happened just there with solar cycle number 12. We haven't got to that yet, but you see we are really not at all far from it, and it won't be very long at all now before we are heading into the true solar minimum of solar cycle 24. And then it will be very interesting to see where we go after that. Will we have another solar cycle for number 25, that is lining up closely to solar cycle 12, or will we do something different? Will we, for example, have an even weaker solar cycle? If we do have an even weaker solar cycle for number 25 than we've had for number 24, then we will have to start thinking about being on a par with these two weakest solar cycles, which are number 5 and number 6 for Dalton minimum solar cycles. There's a lot of speculation at the moment, and various very interesting YouTube channels speculating about ice ages and all of that kind of thing. And whilst I won't go to that level, I don't think we'll have an ice age. There's several reasons for that, primarily because we are at a much warmer global temperature now compared to where we was in the Dalton minimum, not least where we was in the Maunder minimum, where we had the proper little ice age at a much higher level of global temperature now, which will offset some of this. But nevertheless, if we was to start getting to this level with solar cycle number 25, if we was to be on a par with the two Dalton minimum solar cycles of 5 and 6, then whilst I don't think we have an ice age, we would certainly have to think about some brutally cold winters coming along, both in the UK and also in North America as well. So I won't go quite as far as saying an ice age, but I do think that if solar cycle number 25 was to be on a par with those Dalton minimum solar cycles, then it will be a case of watch out. There's got to be some pretty brutal winters in there at some point. Talking of winter, let's just finish off by talking a little bit about the coming winter, 2017-18. So these are the winter CETs over the past solar cycle number 24 compared to the winter CETs for solar cycle number 12, that solar cycle I was just talking about, that we've lined up very closely. Because not only did we line up very close in terms of sunspot numbers, interestingly, we also lined up very closely in terms of the winters, at least for the early part of solar cycle 24. So, for example, this is the first bit, or these are the first winters of the two solar cycles, number 12 and number 24. The first winter of number 12 is 1877, 1878, and the first winter of 24, so cycle 24, is 2007, 2008. You see, they are both milder than average winters, even though we are at true solar minimum at that point. And as I've explained, it tends to be the winters after true solar minimum that tend to be the coldest winters. So the second winter of these two solar cycles is colder than average. It's brutally cold winter, winter number 2 for solar cycle 12, which is 1878, 1879. That's a brutal cold winter. Not anywhere near as cold as that for the current solar cycle number 24, which is 2008, 2009. But it is colder than average. It was the start of a colder run. Then you see the third winter's coming out colder than average, and the fourth winter's coming out colder than average as well. The fifth winters of the two solar cycles come out milder than average. Then the sixth winters, which is 1882, 1883, and 2012, 2013, we get a little bit of a divergence because that's a milder winter for solar cycle number 12, but it's a little bit colder than average for solar cycle 24. Back on trend with the next winter, which comes out milder than average with both of those solar cycles. And then, again, a little bit of a split for the following winter, but broadly similar in that they're both coming out average, really. The winter for solar cycle 12, which is 1884, 1885, is ever slightly milder than average. And actually, 2014, 2015, which is the winter of solar cycle 24, is a little bit cooler than average. But let's say they are both within half a degree of average. So let's say both of those winters are coming out average. But then we've got a split. The next two winters really do break this theory. So the following winter, in terms of solar cycle 12, is 1885-1886, and it's a very cold winter. Whereas the winter for solar cycle 24 is 2015-2016, and it's an exceptionally mild winter. So a big split there, the biggest split that we have seen with this theory up to that point. Was that a one-off? Well, we know that actually, no, it wasn't, because we did it again with last winter. So this is the next winter of solar cycle number 12, and it's 1886-1887, and it's another colder than average winter. But the winter of 2016-2017, that one is coming out milder than average. So up to this point, essentially, we've been running very closely with these winters, although this one, 2012, 2013, isn't quite right. But all the other winters have been running very, very closely with their trends in terms of solar cycles 12 and solar cycles 24 up to this point. But then after that, we've deviated and we've broken the pattern, if you like, over the past two winters. So what's going to be very interesting for this winter, 2017-2018, is whether we continue to deviate or whether we actually go back to the trend that we have seen through this earlier part of the two solar cycles. So the winter of solar cycle number 12, I should say, is 1887-1888. It's indicated by this green box just here. And again, it's another colder than average winter. So many colder than average winters during solar cycle 12. So this was another colder than average winter in solar cycle number 12. Obviously, we haven't got the orange box to go with that just yet. The question is, will the orange box, which is the winter of 2017-2018, it'll be put in just there. Will that orange box be there? Or indeed, will that orange box be up there? Or will that orange box be down there? Or maybe even that orange box might be down there. It'll be very interesting to see whether we do indeed go back to the trend of the two solar cycles and have, if we do go back to trend, we'll have a cold winter, or will we continue to deviate? One interesting factor is that the first time we broke this theory, we broke it big style with this exceptionally mild winter. Last winter, yes, it was milder than average, but nowhere to the same extent. So was last winter the beginning of going back towards the trend, and by next winter, or the coming winter, will we be down here? That's going to be really, really interesting to see. And the reason the winter of 1887 and 1888 was so cold is that it looked like this. So this is the reanalysis that James has sent through for December 1887. We have lots of blocking around Greenland and out to our north and west. This deep, deep trough is over to the east of the country, and we're putting down these cold, northerly, possibly even northeasterly winds. So that looks like a very cold and wintry month there. We go through to January 1888, and it's not as dramatic in terms of perhaps snow potential, but it is a very blocked winter with lots of high pressure to the north of the British Isles, and that will be pulling in plenty of easterly and northeasterly winds as well. And then another really quite dramatic looking chart for February 1888, where we get all of this blocking out to the west and the northwest of the country with the trough underneath it. And yes, we'd be pulling in some bitterly cold air from the east, and this trough, of course, would be providing the energy for plenty of snow, particularly down in the south. And the overall 500 millibar height anomaly composite for the winter of 1887-1888 looks like this, and it looks like quite an extreme block pattern, really, with lots of high pressure around Greenland and Iceland. I have to change the colour. Low pressure is underneath it, through here and through here, and yes, we're pulling down the winds from a northerly or northeasterly direction. So that's how the winter of 1887-1888 looked in terms of reanalysis. And get the right chart up. If we go back to the trend that we had through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 perhaps not to 6 there, but 6 and 7 winters out of this solar cycle. If we go back to that trend and start to trend along the same lines of the CT that we see just here, then we will have a winter that is at least similar in terms of being cold, perhaps not quite as extreme with block pattern, but in terms of being cold, we'll have a winter that is similar to 1887, 1888. And of course, that's what we've got to answer with winter updates. And that brings us back to where we started, really, because as I say, this is the final Solar Sunday of 2017. The reason is that in just 3 weeks' time, 3 weeks from now, we will begin the winter update. So we'll start to answer those questions about whether we're going to go back into a colder winter, such as we had in our counterpart winter in solar cycle number 12. Right, so that's it for the final Solar Sunday of the year. We've talked for 30 minutes. It's been a lot to discuss. Hope you found it interesting and informative. Bit of a bumper Solar Sunday to finish us off for the year. Just say this video will be placed on the Solar Cycles 24-25 updates page later on today. There'll be that written report that goes with it, so you'll be able to come back and watch the video whenever you want. You'll also be able to read the written post. And don't forget, this afternoon we are releasing the first of the season of ECMWF seasonal model interpretations for the winter of 2017-2018. So already, we're not quite at winter updates yet, but already you see things are very, very gradually starting to crank up at Gasworthy's in terms of the winter. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.